And now as...
The process of preservation and technological continuity is critical to our job as carriers of tradition and culture. The first thing we have to do is really to determine what exists, and our job in determining what exists is to really understand what came before us on a deep level. I think the best example for what came before us is really in the classical musical world, where an entire body of music, that of Johann Sebastian Bach, was single-handedly revitalized by one person, by Felix Mendelssohn. And this whole thing of creating a powerful continuity of past and present is the model that we as archivists and preservationists undertake. So that's really the critical form. What came before us? How can we create a bridge from the earlier era through contemporary technology and delivery systems to a completely new generation, so that that culture and that literacy can be interpreted by a new generation? John Philip Sousa, who was the first great star of early recordings, hated recordings. In fact, he coined the term canned music. He saw this as a degradation of culture, of us as a society. What he didn't realize, what no one then realized, is that these tabulas, these tabula rasas, these recordings document an incredibly vibrant part of our collective history as a society and are a gift from an older generation to a contemporary generation. The process whereby we actually do the archaeological work of determining what exists happens through a variety of received media. For example, we go through old record catalogs that were published at the time in order to sell the recordings. We look through old newspapers to see advertisements of what was being sold directly to the public, record reviews of the period. Maybe the best, of course, are the actual records which have survived from previous generations. We look at these records long before we actually listen to them. There is so much information on here that tells us who it was, when it was, what they were doing, what was the context of this material. All of this stuff before the moment that the needle slips into the groove. So we create an entire biography of these recordings, and then the researcher is armed with a deep context to understand how to approach the recording and then to frame it in a way to understand what was the original intention, and then to do the necessary subsequent work of interpreting this music as part of a scholarly and musicological pursuit. I think regardless of which archives, which library, which collection we're talking about, processes are very much the same. That is, one collects the recordings and creates a process whereby they are preserved and transferred for the subsequent generations. Here's the thing, that we know that with each change in technological innovation, the previous era of technology is shunted aside. There's probably, I would guess, maybe only 40% of recordings that were made on cylinders or 78s, which were then commercially issued, reissued onto new technologies, LPs, and then subsequently to CDs. That's the consideration of commercial interests. Libraries and archives cannot make that sort of judgment. Our job is to preserve the entire corpus of the previous generation of technology in order to make it available to future generations. How is this accomplished? Again, this is a pretty standard procedure. A record shows up in an archives, and the determination first is made to create a catalog, taking all of the information from the label that allows us to then find that recording. Record is then prepared for the transfer process. The record is cleaned. The proper sized stylus, which will fit into the groove, enabling us to read out the information that is housed in these grooves, is critical. The better the transfer from the original recording to a new medium means that you could then prepare that record for an easy listening for the subsequent user. So how do we give people the access to this kind of music, given restrictions, technological restrictions, legal restrictions, restrictions of even simple things of who has internet access and who doesn't? Libraries and archives are in the forefront of coming up with policies which challenge issues of micromanaging these materials, where in fact all of these recordings, everything that was recorded and issued to an American listening public, is part of our national heritage and something that is critical to us as a people if we expect to be informed, if we expect to be really insightful about who we are as a society. In some ways, the technological issues which face the preservation and transmission of these recordings to the new generation are simple, because it's just technology. The real problem comes in determining ownership of these recordings. Originally, these recordings, overwhelmingly, were the domain of commercial record companies. They would hire a particular performer to come in, pay them, it's called a work for hire, and then the record company would own that recording. Most of these record companies went through dozens and dozens of owners over their long business lives. So the issues of ownership become a little murky. And in the United States, copyright laws have been, though created in the earliest days during the post-Revolutionary War period, to protect the creator of a particular innovation. Copyright has subsequently come to protect not the creator of the art, but of the mechanical reproduction of that art. So we become sort of derailed from its original intention about the artist who created this work, and instead to the business aspect that owns it. The history of commercial recording is a very forward-moving one. For the most part, record companies did not live off their vaults. They didn't live off their accrued recordings. They constantly moved forward. Certain artists like Caruso were constantly kept in the catalog long after he died. He lived way beyond his actual life on Earth. It really wasn't until the 1950s that a grassroots mass movement of looking back at an entire genre of recorded music in an attempt to bring it fully formed from an earlier period into a contemporary period. This was people who were interested in New Orleans and Dixieland jazz, who really looked in the 1950s back to the 1920s and began as a grassroots movement to take those old records and to reissue them on new technology, which at that time was LPs, microgroove records. Well, this was not the original idea of record companies. This was the fans, the carriers of the culture, the grassroots, the people who took the music into their lives on a visceral level. That really set a model for all other music communities, which started with jazz, then moved into early hillbilly music, early blues, early Broadway and vaudeville music. Our copyright laws in the United States are restrictive in that they do not allow free and open access for a variety of non-commercial uses for these materials. This has meant that an entire cadre of people have emerged whose job is to, in essence, liberate this music from the hold of restrictive access to returning it to its rightful place as part of our birthright as Americans with a lush and meaningful cultural history. We're now involved in an ongoing struggle of the democratizing not only of these materials, but to enable us as a society to gain access to these materials on an as-demand basis. Not for everyone to turn a buck on this, but this is part of our cultural literacy. If this is lost to us, then we lose an important part of who we are as a society. So it's hoped that with these major changes that have happened in the technology, with the internet, in essence, macro democratizing access, this will force a change in the more restrictive, ghettoizing interpretation of copyright law.